Hi everybody, welcome to Indycar on Sunday the 14th of April 2019. Now, many of you on Friday were concerned that I was losing the plot a little bit in my presentation on Friday. And so I apologise to people if you think I'd maybe gone over to the other side and was trying to divide the movement. Not so. All I was worried about, and I worried about several different things at once on Friday. One of them was attacks on the show itself from social media platforms, and the other one is this issue of timing the referendum for independence. As you all know, since Brexit was announced, the SNP has consistently argued against Brexit, and then they switched from arguing against Brexit to fighting against Brexit, fighting for the clause 50, for Article 50 to be revoked, for the whole thing to be stopped. And that has gradually been turned into not so much stopping Brexit but slowing it down so that we have time to think about what happens next, and also working with other parties to make sure that we don't leave the EU, or that we don't leave the customs union, or we don't leave the single market. All of which we know is probably not going to happen, because we know that no deal Brexit is now completely out of the picture, because neither the European Union nor the British government was prepared to actually go through with the threat of carrying it out. So both of them were bluffing. Both of them have now had that myth exploded. So no deal Brexit is not going to happen. It can't happen. So some kind of Brexit is now definitely going to happen. It's just a case of what kind. Now, my point on Friday was about the SNP risking losing more membership over its continual delaying tactics, because it has had to, over the last few months, appear to be, at least, trying to prevent the damage that Brexit was going to cause, not just to Scotland, but to the rest of the UK. And the statesmanship that has been shown has been very obvious from Nicola Sturgeon from the beginning. And she has won plaudits all across the world for her steady statesmanship and her clear position on Brexit, against Brexit, I should point out. But, and this is what my show was about on Friday, we have, up until this point, been basically play acting, because although we don't want Brexit to happen, we don't want Brexit to happen because it disadvantages the movement towards independence, not because it's going to be particularly bad for England. England is basically not our problem. They have their own reasons for Brexit. But we need to stop pretending that the reason that we're trying to stop Brexit is to help the rest of the UK. We're not trying to help the rest of the UK. We need to be clearer. We need to be clearer with our own supporters that the reason why we are slowing down Brexit, why we're trying to frustrate it, and why Nicola Sturgeon and Ian Blackford have been so hard working against it, is not to save England from itself, but to save Scotland from having to have an independence referendum after we've left the EU. Because this is my point. We need to reassure the people who now believe that Nicola Sturgeon has somehow been turned. Whether or not you and I believe that or not is immaterial. A lot of people are beginning to think it, because it's not being articulated what the truth is. And the truth is that the SNP needs to keep us inside the EU while we have a referendum on independence, for a number of extremely good strategic and economic and political reasons. But that's not what we're being told. That was my point. We're not being told anything. We are being kept in the dark by our own side. I'm not quite sure exactly why they can't say, look, we are fighting against Brexit, but not to save England and Wales from Brexit, or even necessarily Northern Ireland, although we'll try. The main reason we don't want to leave the EU is because when we ask the question, do you want to be an independent country? Again, we want Scotland to still be in the EU at that point. Despite what we've heard about having to rejoin the European Union, if you are already a member of the European Union when you have separated yourself from your little British Union, you are still a member state at that point, and all of the people in Scotland are still European Union citizens, because that hasn't changed yet. The European Union would then be forced to decide on the status of Scottish citizens having decided to leave the UK. And the European Union would then be free to take a different position. They wouldn't necessarily have to impose a complete starting from the beginning, rejoining the EU procedure, because Scotland already is in it. They've already accepted us. And to refuse us entry and make us go all the way to the back of the queue would be nonsensical. And not only that, it would be highly inefficient and troublesome to the EU to do it. So for this reason, at least, the SNP is trying to keep us in the EU, and I can respect that. But the problem is that's not what the independence movement in general, I'm talking about the grassroots independent supporters who are not in the SNP, it's not what they're being told. We are not being told anything at all. We're guessing what the motivations of the SNP are. Even the SNP's own members are beginning to get agitated and are beginning to doubt their leadership. And my point on Friday was, in a game of brinkmanship, there comes a point where you have to put your cards on the table. This is the point. This is where we're at. And I know the SNP's been trying to time this so it happened during their conference after the Easter recess. But even just a few words to steady the troops and to say, look, don't worry, we're not siding with the British state here in Brexit. That's not what we're about. We are trying to prevent Brexit because we want our campaign for independence to start while we're inside the EU, and while things are relatively stable, and while there is a window of opportunity to do it, without the pandemonium that would happen of trying to do it during or after Brexit. So what Friday's show was about was the fact that we have reached that point. We've reached that point where the cards have to be laid on the table. And the reason is that there's a small window of time that is opened for Scotland to have its referendum. And that small window stretches from here until, at the very latest, October. But it might be sooner than that, because the British government might suddenly move and actually agree on Mrs May's Brexit deal, in which case the timeline is off again. But if they don't, and if they delay further and we do end up having elections to the European Union, and it seems that the SNP is preparing for that, incidentally, but if that happens, then we would have the time to both call and organise a referendum. Things are so uncertain at the moment that we need a little bit of certainty. But my biggest problem has always been with the SNP, and it's a criticism which I think is fair, is that they don't communicate with their support. They don't tell us anything. If you're a non-member of the SNP, you get told absolutely nothing. If you're a member of the SNP, you're told, don't worry, trust Nicola, she's got it under control. We know things that you don't. Which is fine. That's a bit like, trusting in some kind of God. You know it exists because your priests have told you it exists and it's going to be all right. But we're acting on faith here, and some of us, particularly me, like to see a little bit of communication from the leadership of Scotland at the moment. It's just basically to steady the nerves a bit and to calm the fears and to stop the people who do have these conspiracy theories from allowing that doubt to infect the rest of the movement. This is what I was on about. I wasn't saying that there is a conspiracy. I'm saying that the people who say there are conspiracies are having fuel added to the fire. We don't want that. We want things to be known. We want people to know that our government is still moving towards independence, and that the whole point of what they're doing is geared to that. And that needs to come from the top down, not from the bottom up. People are guessing, even in the SNP, they're not getting information. It's very, very secretive. One last thing. I was hearing quite a lot of listening to some TV debates and things like that. A lot of English people said they voted Brexit because they wanted to get back some control. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that English people who voted for Brexit see that as them becoming free, them getting their identity back, getting back control over their laws and their powers and their finances. They don't see the irony of Scotland being put in the same position by England. But when English people say that the European Union has removed their identity, what they mean is it's not their British identity that's been removed, it's their English identity. But I have to remind those people in England that if they're worried about becoming identityless, lacking the Englishness that they crave, then the simplest answer to that is to stop pretending that there's a place called Great Britain, or that you're British in some way, or that you're some kind of UK citizen. People in England are still English. They live in England. People in Scotland are still Scottish. They live in Scotland. There's nothing wrong with any of those two things. But when English people say they've lost their identity, they still call themselves British. Americans think of English people as British. They see Scottish people as something different. If you ask an American what a British accent sounds like, he will pick a plummy London accent. He won't pick a Scottish accent. British is how the English people have created themselves. They've created a new identity. They're actually frightened to say they're English now, for fear of sounding politically incorrect and upsetting the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish. I don't feel upset by English people saying that they're English and they're proud to be English and they're proud of their heritage. That's great, wonderful. Get your heritage back. Why should you lose your identity because you created a fake country called Great Britain, which doesn't actually exist? GB is not a country. GB is two countries in a union. It was from the start, Scotland and England together, two countries in a political union together, right? And that political union now doesn't suit these two countries. England can quite happily say, look, Great Britain's a bad idea now. UK is a bad idea. Let's go back to having England doing its thing and Scotland doing its thing, and just separate and agree to be friends and have a treaty between us that allows us to trade together. Because really that's what this is all about. Brexit has actually woken up the English electorate to the fact that they've lost their identity and they've lost control of their own country as well. That's how they feel, that's why they want Brexit. We want independence for exactly the same reasons. And actually, many Brexiters can understand that if you explain it to them that way. So that was just a little additional piece to the show today, but worth remembering if you're talking to a Brexiter, that it's all right for England to be English, and it's okay for them to hark back to the days when England controlled its own finances, made its own decisions about trading. That's fine. There is nothing wrong with that view. Whether we think it's politically or economically a good idea is none of our business. It's what they want. For us, we want to have full control back for a different reason. And we want to remain part of the European Union because it gives us some strength that we wouldn't have as a very small country just trading on our own. It's good to be part of a block of countries. It would be good to be part of a European free trade alliance, the small group of countries which trades into Europe, the Nordic countries and Switzerland and so on. That would be terrific as well. But we can do that. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. And we need to stop trying to bully English people, trying to make them out to be something they're not. They're not British any more than we are. They are English people. They have their own agenda and their own needs, and we need to say that's okay. But it's okay so long as we part company and we do our thing and they do theirs and we respect one another. I have no problem with any of this at all. I have friends in England, I have relatives in England, I have a brother who lives in England, and what England needs is not what we need. Or what Scotland needs is not what England needs. And so we have to part. They have to stop trying to force these two countries together. They're like the same pole of the same magnet being pushed together. They cannot stick together anymore because they're pushing apart. They're poles apart, as they say. Anyway, that's it for today. Just to reassure you, I haven't gone nuts. I haven't gone over to the other side and become a divisionist amongst independence movement. That's not my point. My point is that the SNP needs to communicate more with the general public in Scotland, not just SNP upper echelons. Pardon me. And also, it needs to make clear the reasons why it is trying to stop Brexit. And it's not, as we have been pretending, it's an open secret all over England, Wales and Northern Ireland, that the SNP is not supporting repealing the Brexit legislation just for the good of the rest of the country. It's part of our strategy to leave the union. Why don't we just be honest about it? I mean, everybody in politics knows it's true. They know that the SNP is not trying to stop Brexit for the good of the UK. They're trying to stop Brexit for the good of the independence campaign. And why not just be honest and say that? You know, why not just reassure your own members and your own supporters that that's what you're doing? Trying to kid on that we're working with the British state is leading to these divisions, and that's what I was trying to point out on Friday. If we pretend to be working with the UK, with GB, to help the GB people, including ourselves, to stay a part of Europe, then we're playing a dangerous game of pretense. But it's a pretense that people believe, and not just the people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but people in the independence movement are beginning to think this is true as well. That's the trouble. It's been very convincing that we are playing our role as a great British nation trying to help everybody to stay in the EU. It's not the truth. The truth is we're trying to leave the UK, and we need to remain in the EU so that when we've had our referendum, we're still Europeans. Why not just say it? That's the truth of the matter. And when I broadcast things, I try and broadcast what I think is the truth of the situation. And this is what I believe should happen. We should be honest with ourselves. We're trying to stay in the EU so that we can be independent. Why not say it? That's it. See you later.